You've probably heard that the ISO 19650 series are changing, and they are. They are in draft and they will be updated soon. We're going to have a look at part 1, ISO 19650 part 1, and the proposed changes. My name is Stephen and I'm here talking on behalf of BIM Enable. We are associate consultants and affiliates of the BSI. The content that you're going to see is not formally on behalf of the International Standards Organization, ISO, or the BSI. It's on behalf of BIM Enable and myself. However, I do know a little bit about the standards, having taught them for a long time and implementing them as an advisor and consultant to many. So we're going to have a look at the changes. We're going to look at part 1, focus on that one. If you're not familiar at all with the standards, that's fine. If you do know the standards, then obviously we'll look at the changes there. So we're going to introduce them in a way that we assume that people don't know what the standards are. And you can see there has been a change in language, which we are going to go through in detail from BIM, and more of a focus on information management and looking at the whole life of a built asset. Now, the standards did cover that already, but it's made stronger. So some of the things we will address are these questions. At the end, we will answer these. We're obviously going to cover more than this, but at an absolute fundamental level, we're going to look at what is changing in part 1. The terminology around BIM and the broadening of information management, we're going to look at that. What does whole life asset information mean in practice? I'm going to give you some examples. Why does information purpose matter more than deliverables? So again, there's a real focus on purpose. Why do we want the information? Again, there always was in the standards, but again, it's stronger than before, a stronger message. Slight difference in how we describe the common data environment. If you don't know what the CDE or common data environment is, that's fine. We're going to look at that as well. And which templates terminologies, so the terms and training, may need updating. So we're going to look at what you might want to focus on now to prepare yourself for the changes. So we will answer these questions at the end. Again, to caveat it, this presentation again, as we will, these are draft standards that we're going to look at the terminologies. They are subject to change. So anything you see in this presentation doesn't constitute formal advice, and please read the actual draft standards. There we go. So we've made that caveat again, but I think you get the idea. So for people that don't know the standards at all, the ISO 19650 series of standards evolved from what were the United Kingdom standards, which were called BS and PAS 1192 or 1192 suite. We now have the ISO 19650 series, and again we're looking at the updates. So the first parts of ISO 19650 series came out in 2018. And again, we transitioned into them in 2019, the beginning of 2019. They are focused on managing information. They always have been. Certainly there was more of a focus on BIM or building information modeling, which we'll mention again, but they're still absolutely clearly focused on information management and the information needed to make decisions before, during, and after construction projects. So again, it's for the whole life. So you can see there we're mentioning the asset life cycle. The physical asset life cycle does involve construction, but it involves a lot more. Operations, decommissioning, reuse, repurpose, planning. So again, the standards could have always been applied for that, and the focus could be for that, but a lot of people were only focused on projects. The new standards are focused on whole life more clearly. And we do, as I mentioned, we do look at why the information is needed. So you'll see at the bottom there when we talk about purposes from different perspectives. So who needs information? For what purpose? Why do they need it? To represent the 6 parts of the ISO 19650 series, we have this graphic. If you buy them, they don't have this colourful graphic. It's just a representation that we've made. But you get the idea. There are six. There are 6 parts, and very briefly, part 1 we're going to look at. That's the concepts and principles. Part 2 is in a different presentation. We'll look at that in detail, but that's is now called when it's released. So the information management process. Part 3 will become a guide. So traditionally that's been to do with operations. Again, that's in a different presentation, but that will be an implementation guide, as you can see. Part 4 is about information exchange. That's the name of it. And quality. So we've added that there. It is about quality, checking quality, validating the quality of information at that exchange point. What's the criteria for that? Part 5 is about a security-minded approach, about the physical and the cyber, the digital considerations, about both. So about the cyber-physical relationship and security. And part 6 is about health and safety information. How can that be managed and structured in a way that it can be reused? And so we'll do other presentations on all of them. There's a lot to discuss, but we are going to focus on part 1. So what does part 1 cover? Again, many of you will be very familiar. Some people won't be familiar at all. So again, to remind ourselves, it is about the overall concepts and principles for all the other 19650 series. Again, it's about managing information. That's what it's about. It's about information management in the built environment for built assets, for physical built assets. Information management is a broad topic and it's a profession. And there are other standards, particularly around data management, master data management, data quality, document management, which exist already. So I already have a background in data and information management outside of the built environment, but just be really clear, this standard is focused on information management for the built environment assets. And again, just to reiterate, at the bottom right there, you can see it is about the whole life cycle of the asset. So before, during and after construction, definitely the operations, yes, maintenance, refurbishment, end of life, reuse. It covers everything, and I can assure you people are looking at long-term reuse of information. I happen to have partly a background in the railway sector, and absolutely there are still some assets that that are 200 years old, and we have information on that. It wasn't necessarily digital originally, but we're talking, long-term, and it varies depending on what asset you're focused on. So looking at a high level at the differences between the 2018, the current version, at the time of recording, the current version. And what's the focus of that on the left there? It is about BIM according to the ISO 19650 series. So it is about BIM. We're not going to get into the definition of BIM, but it's definitely about having a reliable basis for decision making, having the right information. So as we know, BIM is part of that. BIM, building information modeling, is just one type of information. We are also focused on documents, survey data, for example, GIS, geographic information data. That's all in scope. So in the new version, in the current draft version of part 1, so we're calling that the 2026 draft there, the language is slightly different. We're talking about information management according to ISO 19650. And as you can see there, we're talking about BIM is positioned as part of the wider whole life approach. There's lots more to focus on rather than just BIM. It's not that we're forgetting BIM, absolutely not. It's just one consideration, and it may or may not be the core consideration depending who you are, what information you're using for what purpose, at what stage in the life cycle of the asset. So you can see at the bottom, we're just mentioning some types of users and domains. So for example, facilities management, digital, IT, governance, and we mean corporate governance. So is information used at a senior manager level? Of course it is. Project planning. Might that come through the common data environment, which we'll mention what that is later, of course. Would you define it as BIM information? Maybe not. Maybe sometimes yes, but many times no. Health and safety, for example. Quality assurance. I could go on. Legal, finance. All different types of information may or may not be BIM information. So the terminology is broader. It is definitely restructured to make sure it includes all the other parts. So again, the first point there is we're talking about part 4, part 5, part 6 are now explicitly mentioned. Due to the timing, the years at which they were published, it simply didn't mention the other standards because they simply weren't published at the time. In 2018, the standards came out at other years later in many cases. So again, it's all encompassing now. Some things have changed at the bottom left there. Some of the terms have been updated. We're going to look at them. That's a core part of what we're going to look at. Some of the different language. The content has been revised. There's different graphics. We're not going to go into all the graphics. You need to look at the actual standards, buy the standards when they're finally published, and also look at the draft standards. So again, this presentation doesn't replace you looking at the standards. You must look at the standards and understand them and look at the guide. So we will go through part 2, part 3 in a different presentation. And the structure has been rebuilt to tell the information management story more logically. So more chronological, more sequential, more logical. So for people that don't know, what do we mean by whole asset lifecycle? I also have a background in asset management, and I mean asset management systems, physical asset management linked to international standards. Many people don't. They are focused on different phases of the life cycle of an asset. It could be construction, it could be something else. So there's different ways of looking at it, but this is one way of looking at it. The strategy before. Do we need to design something? Do we need a new asset? Now, that's one of the questions. Do I need a new office building? Do I need a new railway bridge, a new power station, a new renewable solar farm? This is strategic. How will it relate to other things? I'm planning on potentially building something. Will it affect transportation? So again, that's all strategic. That's arguably, it is quite beyond the standard scope, that more whole strategic, but the information impacts, that's what we're focused on. Might we need different information? So strategy, design, could be designing any kind of asset, construction or build, physically building or constructing the asset, operation, using the asset, and providing critically services. So, for example, a transportation network, we provide services. An electrical, a power station provides energy. It's a service. Water infrastructure provides fresh water. Sewer treatment works. So it's the services. We don't get into that too much, but that's absolutely critical. What can we do with the asset? Maintenance, maintaining. So facility management might be crossing operations, maintenance, but we'll keep the generic terms here, operation, maintenance, and then end of life. And as we know, there's potentially more to it than that. So assets maybe do get decommissioned or not, depending what they are, but it could be they're reused, even if it's simply a building or a bridge, for example. A railway bridge becomes a pedestrian bridge, or who knows, different types of asset. A building gets multiple different purposes. It has a refit. So we've put there reuse, recycling, decommissioning, and disposal of equipment. So we have to consider how we dispose, if that's the right thing to do, the materials, the products, the systems. So again, I've mentioned it already a few times, but ISO 9650 Part 1 does cover the end-of-life considerations. Absolutely, that has to be considered, and we need the right people. So something I've added here is this sort of feedback loop, if you like. Again, we've always considered this. Certainly we do it on projects, as an example. And we do it in infrastructure. So, for example, railways, highways, energy, water, infrastructure. Of course, we have lessons learned. If somebody's managing millions of assets in a large infrastructure or network, there is strategy. There are lessons learned. There are large systems, but we're making it explicit here. We're making that feedback loop. So that line, that arrow at the bottom, is the intelligence, the information, the data, the learnings, the lessons learned. We can see there being fed back into the potentially the next project or the next sort of operations. So you could have that line go back to operations, for example, but in this case we'll stick to a project. Where might we want to add something there? We might want to add planning and development, for example. There might be, it's not that we don't have planning and development, it's just that it wasn't on the previous diagram. That is something we do before. We might reuse information, we might put them lessons learned into the planning phase very early. We might have learnt something on previous projects, if it is a project, or operations, for example, or maintenance, that could feed into development, for example. So that's one way of looking at it. Now, again, this is a different topic, but there is a huge overlap. And this is for people that don't know, there is already a very mature international standard called ISO 55001, which is the management system standard. A management system standard is something like ISO 9001. Management system, we do not mean IT, we mean the governance framework, policies, procedures, things like this. So 55001 covers in theory, any kind of asset, anything of value or potential value to an organisation. Does it cover buildings? Does it cover infrastructure like railways? 100%. We're starting to use it more in the public sector, more than perhaps traditionally, for different types of asset. But how does it relate to this? Well, that's the bigger picture. Why do we want the information? What do we want to consider about the whole life of the asset? And something else we have in ISO 55001, and there is a series, you can see there ISO 55000 series, there are others. We already have something called a Strategic Asset Management Plan, or even we call it a SAMP. That's been around for a long time, right? So the standards evolved, and even evolved from a previous standard or publicly available specification called PAS 55. Which happened to also originate from the United Kingdom. So we already have that, that overview, and we already have information for managing our assets. So we're bringing them together. We're bringing these sort of domains closer than they have been. What I've added there is a line at the top. We're talking about the whole life asset management. Well, surely that does include the top row as well. Of course it does. And the context, or some of the context, is around the organisational strategy. What does the organisation do? Again, if I'm a railway, if I'm an energy provider, if I'm water infrastructure, if I provide buildings, government buildings, schools, hospitals. Again, there's an organisational strategy existing. Why do I have my assets? Again, that's sort of beyond or broader than the scope of this standard, but we feed into it. So one way of looking at it is to say, well, we already have this whole life asset management consideration in ISO 55000. We're adding a focus on that information, whole life asset information management, I'm calling it there. And there is this core concept called an asset information model, or an AIM, asset information model, or AIM. Some people might even call it that. I'll try to use the long form. And that's the information that is collected and maintained critically before, during and after projects. So again, it's not, the focus is not a construction project, it's before, it's after, it's forever, for the whole life. Literally, we mean that, the whole life of the asset. So we call it a asset information model. Obviously, I use the more traditional symbol representing a database. Let's move on to something more abstract. It may or may not be a database. In fact, it almost certainly will be more than one database nowadays. So we'll call it an AIM, Asset Information Model, and there are trigger events. Something happens. Maybe there's something happens to an asset, whether it's an inspection, whether it's we add something to the asset, something fails, there's a fire. We want to build a new asset. That's fairly significant. It exists. The asset comes into being, or we refurbish it. We refer to them as trigger events, and we have done for a long time in the standards. But just again, some examples to keep it simple. It could be I'm going to build or refurbish something. That's significant. Or I might be maintaining it or changing the asset. So again, you can see at the bottom there's a trigger event. Asset-related project is what we're referring to, the management of the information. Asset-related project, and the project, as far as we're concerned in this standard now, could be in the maintenance phase or in a different phase. It isn't just a capital delivery project. We don't mean that. And then we have information come out of that activity. So just one example to give different illustrations as we go. It could be some kind of office building here. Again, it could be any kind of built asset. So it could be office buildings and the estate as a whole. Again, it depends who is considering this building. The user, the owner, the occupier, the facility manager, the estates manager. It's a real estate individual looking at the value. There's hundreds, I'm just giving examples, lots of different perspectives. There's maybe half a dozen that are the key ones, but again, there's many different perspectives. It might be from a security perspective. That could be a secure building, for example. So the building is the building, right? Again, it exists, it provides services, it's linked to systems. So again, one way of just considering that is, well, there's information under the scenes. And I originally have a background in geographic information systems, sort of mapping, and we literally talk about layers of information. And it does look not dissimilar, maybe it's not quite stylized as this, but it's not dissimilar to this representation. Literally, you can see a representation of the underground utilities, the buried services. Someone is considering them, Does this building need a backup generator? Where does it come from? So one thing to consider would be the office buildings and estate data information and documents and other types of information. We would class that under information as far as this standard is concerned, as well as data. And the enabling technologies. Do we have the right IT, the information technology, to link it? So it's just an example of one consideration. And I'll give more examples as we go, different asset types, just to make the point. So some of the terms have changed. Again, we are introducing the standard for people that do not know, but again, for people that do know, just briefly, and again, I encourage you strongly, we are affiliates to the BSI for you to actually get a copy of the standard when it's published, and indeed in draft if you're seeing this at the right time, and you can still review the draft version. So again, just briefly going through these, the change of the terms of the first point there is it was more around delivery. That sort of implies the project. Well, it didn't imply it was for part 2. It certainly was about that. We're now talking about information production. People produce information, author information, create information, capture information. Again, there's different language we could use. So, for example, capture we tend to use in surveying. But you might say authoring if it's CAD or more traditional building information management technology. So we're talking about production. It's information production. Whether it is or whether it isn't to do with a capital delivery project, it doesn't matter, right? Someone's producing information. It could be for a maintenance reason. It could be because I'm the owner of the asset and I want to sell the asset. I need more information. I want extra surveys. So the other term that's changed or is being proposed to be changed as the draft is around the delivery team. Again, the information production team rather than the delivery team. This is sort of a big one in the term, the next one, in the sense of many people will be familiar with the term EIR, or Exchange Information Requirement. Not everyone will know necessarily what it means, but they will have heard of it. That's going to change to the Information Production Requirements. So again, the requirements for information production, should be self-explanatory. And EIR, for the people that do know, when we only had the British standards, in the sense of they weren't international at that time, we called it the Employer's Information Requirements. But since 2018, it has been called the Exchange Information Requirements. So sort of a long time. BIM Execution Plan, or the BEP for some people, that is being proposed to be called the Information Production Plan. So again, we're keeping that theme of information production. And what's currently called, at the time of recording, again, check, has the standard been published? Not yet, maybe. The Master MIDP, or the Master Information Delivery Plan, and the Task Information Delivery Plan. Again, I won't go into too much detail, but they're linked, let's put it that way. And the MIDP, the Master Information Delivery Plan, is derived from the aggregation of the Task Information Delivery Plans, when specifically exactly what information is going to be produced, in what format, to what granularity or level of information need at what point, for what purpose. That concept is going to be called the Information Production Schedule, or Schedule, depending where you are in the world. So again, similar concept. Does it have to be, traditionally that's been in a spreadsheet, depending where you are in the world. Does it have to be? Of course not. It would make more sense to have it in an information system, and you can sort, filter. So again, the standards won't tell you exactly prescriptively how you manifest or implement these requirements, but that's what we need. And the last one there at the bottom left, the CDE, or the Common Data Environment, which has been a term we're still using and have been using since 2007, back with BS 1192/2007. The term CDE is still used, but there's a broader term now introduced, in enabling technologies, which certainly many people will have been using for a long time. So again, there's a little bit more about that. The CD becomes something a bit broader that we'll mention in a moment. So information starts with purpose, not deliverables. And I would argue this has always been the case. I would argue most of the point, not everything, but many of the concepts that are made clearer in the ISO/DIS 19650 Part 1 2026 is they're just being made clearer, right? It's just really clear. So again, we talk about the perspectives, the purpose. The perspective is like, who needs the information? Why do they need it? Who are they? Who is the actor, the stakeholder? What's their function, their role? Is it an organization? So from what perspective do I need information? And then from that, their purpose. So what will they use the information for? Why do they need it? What will they do with the information? What system will it be used in? What decisions will be made? Yeah. Are they going to be made now, or do I need it for the future? The information. So that's clearer than it was before. Then we define that. That's called the requirement. We say, well, we've considered these things and we've deduplicated all of these purposes and perspectives, and we're asking for, if you like, a clean, a considered requirement. Right? So we don't want to be asking for the same information many times. This is inefficient. That would be ironic considering what we're trying to do with the standards. So we have a clean requirement document, if it is indeed an actual document, but a clean requirement that's shared. People produce information, so whether it's captured, created, however it's produced, in whatever format is appropriate, and then it's shared. We call how it's shared is, we call that an information model. So again, that's a concept, but anyway, the information is shared. We're calling that an information model, and that contributes towards the asset information model. Again, this aggregation, this accumulation of information. I did say I mentioned the CDE just in a little bit more detail. Again, that terminology is still in there. It's not gone away. It's just probably how I would have described it anyway traditionally, but it was sort of unclear whether it was one technology or not. It's always been a concept, arguably. So again, would it be one platform, as in technology platform? No. And for large projects, it never has been anyway. It's always been multiple systems. However, it's clearer. So you can see it was described more as maybe even a single source of truth, which implied maybe one technology before. Again, didn't have to be. But it's clearer now on the right there. You can see in the draft for part 1, it is clearly about the information production workflow. So it's about, which we used to more call the process, but we'll come on to that on the next slide. It's just what are the stages or states of information? How is it flowing? How is it progressing in its maturity, the information? The technologies, absolutely, they're not going anywhere. You need technology to do this, right? So we're calling that the enabling technology. It's a different consideration. Plural, enabling technologies. And then the ability to have a journal, an archive, and allow permissions and keep control of the states of the information. Again, is something we've always had, but again, it's very clear that we separate the considerations. A different way of looking at the states has existed for the Common Data Environment since 2007. There's been some changes along the way. So 2007, I'm referring to that again, was the UK standards, and but since 2018, if we get back to ISO 19650 part 1, since 2018 we had 4 states, right? We now have 5. We have work in progress, shared, submitted is new, and published, which we had before, and archived, which is shown in archived is shown in a better, clearer way here. It's an audit trail. It's an archive of change. It's not the end of life. That was sort of shown as the way it was interpreted before. That was wrong. It's not. The standard was quite clear that it was what it was, but again, people's interpretation was archive was the end of life. No, it's a change audit. As we can see there. So again, 2018 moves from work in progress to shared, as we've said, and then 2026, as I've said, introduces this concept of submitted. And again, it's when the information, as you can see at the top right there, it's when the information moves from the information production team. So it's submitted to what we would call the appointing party, or the client, or the appropriate people. It's being submitted to be checked, to be validated. If we just go back there, just at the terms, I won't go into this in any detail, but you can see the language there just before and after submitted. It's being shared, and then it's being authorized to be submitted and reviewed, and then it's either rejected or accepted, and if it is accepted, then it moves into published. So again, there's different terms you can see: approved, authorized, accepted. Again, we will go through that in more detail on a different presentation. Likewise, you need to get the actual standards. Now, I know many standards very well. The ISO 19650 series I've been teaching since it came out, and its predecessors in the UK for a long time, it's over a decade now. So there's lots of other standards that always have been, that are linked and potentially linked to ISO 19650. So it can never really be a completely exhaustive list. However, in ISO 19650 part 1 of the draft version, it's really good that we've got sort of a hierarchy, but a consideration of what is perceived as the standard that is the highest relevance, medium to high, medium, medium to low. So what should you be familiar with? Again, we need to go through these standards on a different another occasion, but again, you can see the high ones there, right? So just briefly mentioning them, the first one there is ISO 7817 Part 1. And again, that's about the level of information need. So again, really important, because we mentioned level of information need multiple times in the ISO 19650 series. We don't elaborate on it that much. 7817 does, Part 1, and there are other standards in draft, but Part 1 is published. So please look at that. Again, it considers why do we need information as an example, and who's going to use it. But it gives more consideration about how do we get to the level of information need. Other standards that are mentioned as high there is ISO 29481 parts 1 to 3, and they are related to the Information Delivery Manual, or the IDM. And again, you need to read the standards, but they're considering a method for structuring information about how it's shared. Again, need to look at the standards, but they're absolutely really pivotal to front load or to help shape ISO 19650 series and make them work, provide more detail. Some other standards is ISO 12006 Part 2. I'm sure many people will be familiar with Omniclass and Uniclass. So again, that's their classification systems. In fact, Uniclass is required by the Central United Kingdom government, for example, and in the Republic of Ireland and other places. Omniclass is the equivalent, the counterpart in North America particularly. There are other systems, but they're just examples that both conform to the requirements of ISO 12006 Part 2. So that's how that standard fits in. And the last one I'll mention is 12006 Part 3. That defines an object-oriented framework for construction information dictionaries. Again, there's lots more we could talk about. The other one I'll just mention briefly is where it says medium, it says ISO 16739 Part 1, and that's about the industry foundation classes, or the IFC model. Now, of course, Building Smart International is the place to look for more information, as well as the standard. IFC is a way of structuring information in a schema to share it, if you don't know. So there's other standards, and we acknowledge them. And this is, again, if you're familiar with the standards, maybe not news to you, but for many people it will be, to say, well, you should be looking at these other standards. They're important. They provide a framework around ISO 19650. And it's important because, again, it's this bigger picture. Just taking a breather for a moment, looking at a different asset type. Here we've got a government building, government estate, government property. Again, we're considering it as a whole. Somebody is. Again, it might not be you. I often do get involved with government property as it happens. So again, it's, there aren't 4 buildings. If you're a government, there are thousands. There's maybe not millions of buildings necessarily, but there's thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of assets, depending how you look at it. So again, it's at scale. ISO 19650 series can be used at any scale. Just to be very clear, it's scalable. It's about the correct sort of being proportionate and appropriate about implementing the standard. But again, real value can often be because it's at scale, with repeatable considerations. Let's try to get consistent information. But again, if it's if it's 1 or 2 buildings, or it's a small local authority, it absolutely can work as well. Again, the language to consider there is appropriate and proportionate. Not too much. You need less detail. The way I always think about it is, would you want the same kind of information considerations if you're building a bus shelter or a school, a small school in a village, for example? Would you want the same kind of consideration with these assets as you would if you're building a nuclear power station? No, I don't think so. The complexity. Likewise, I could be building a whole railway, literally the whole railway, millions of new assets. And you can, and people are, and have successfully implemented ISO 19650 series. So again, just consider it is scalable. So again, that's why I'm showing the different asset types. It's just to remind people we're not necessarily talking about a whole nation. So what this means for guidance, training and implementation, I mean the changes, that's what we mean by that. So again, the purpose of this presentation is to point people in the right direction and to have a consideration, start to think now before the changes have taken place and what that transition might look like. Again, you can't, people can't change things overnight. Even if the standard came out tomorrow, or maybe it's already come out, depending when you see this, it's not necessarily the right thing to change immediately. It has to be phased. It has to align with contracts, with the ability of the technology, like I say, the contracts, the people involved, many things, integration, training, upskilling. So we're just considering, how we transition, how we move between the standards. One thing to consider, which is an easier thing to look at first, is the vocabulary. The language is changing. Depending how you look at it, some people say it's a radical difference. Personally, I don't think so. I don't think there's anything radical. Is there a change? 100%. Is it radically different? My opinion is no. But it will involve changes. I'm not saying otherwise. Likewise, technology may or may not have to be changed. Well, it will have to be changed to some extent, but what will the impact be? It depends. So we need to look at the purpose of why things are changing. We need to look at why we want the information to be more consistent, and why we're looking at whole life, how might it impact the way we structure models, for example. We ideally want to broaden the audience. Again, that's the driving reasons behind the changes to ISO 19650 series, parts 1, 2 and 3, is because one of the challenges is the language is quite impenetrable. Again, I professionally have taught the standards to multiple people, many people, over definitely thousands of people over a decade. People have different backgrounds, so whether it's their domain, their sector, where they are in the world, some of the terminologies just do not translate very well. So hopefully the restructuring and the rephrasing of some of the concepts makes more sense, and we can have a broader audience. And we're reframing the common data environment to say it's not, and indeed it probably wasn't a single platform for a lot of people, but we're making it clearer. It's going to be something broader. It's that workflow as well. So again, we need that broader audience. We need adoption to be increased, and the communication is one of the first challenges. Absolutely. So again, I've mentioned this already, but again, just to make sure we've got it in there, to note about the status. So again, it's currently, at the time of recording at least, the current standard is ISO 9650 Part 1 2018. And at the time I'm doing this presentation, it is in draft ISO/DIS, draft international standard is DIS. 19650 Part 1 2026 is draft. So again, as I've already said, please do use appropriate caution about some of the terminologies changing, but nevertheless, that's what they are at the moment. So please plan, let's put it that way. We do look at the whole life in both the previous standards. Certainly Part 2, Part 3 looked at the whole life, but we're making it clearer. Again, we've mentioned that already. It's really important. And the last point that we've already mentioned is we talk less about BIM. That's a key point. So you can see there's a lot the same, right? The concepts are the same. Remember, Part 1 is about the concepts and principles. The concepts and principles are broader. Some of the detail has been removed from Part 1 and put more into Part 2, which is right, because a concept is a concept. It should be broad by definition. And the principles don't necessarily need to explain how you do things. It's a principle. So again, it's part one is sort of appropriately high level. We keep the concepts and principles that are absolutely kept is the concept of an appointing party. So again, if you're not familiar, that is typically the client, whether it's the owner, the operator, some other kind of client, could be a client within a project, but we're calling that the appointing party. It may or may not be under a formal contract. It's whoever's appointing information. So again, it depends. People are naturally going to think about a commercial contract. Doesn't have to be. It could be government to government through a memorandum of understanding, for example. There's no commercial contract necessarily between government entities. But can we use the standards? 100%, and people are using them. So the appointed party is, if you like, the requester, but the appointed party. Lead appointed party is, some people might call these like the principal contractor, the lead contractor, principal designer, the prime contractor, different terms, but whoever's leading, and again there's multiple different variations of structure, but they're going to be responsible for overseeing the information, for managing the information. So this difference between information production and information management is made a lot clearer in ISO 19650 Part 1, the draft version 2026. So they're coordinating, the lead appointed party is coordinating the information production. They're managing, making sure it gets, the appointed party is still involved, absolutely, in information management, but the lead appointed party is absolutely really involved in that information production, overseeing that and producing some information. And then the appointed parties are, you might say, subcontractors, whatever the right language is. Doesn't have to be using that word, but they will respond to the lead appointed party and the information flows. So we keep the same terminology. If you knew that already, it's a similar story now. So the process is presented as nested whole life activity on here. So again, we've got the whole life cycle for the information management. Again, I've mentioned ISO 55001. Now that's even broader. That's not represented on here. That's a whole government looking at all their assets, perhaps. Why do they need assets? The services. Let's get back to the information. So we'll look at the asset lifecycle information management. Each project responding to a trigger event is focused. Now it could be construction, it could be capital delivery, capital expenditure money, could be operational expenditure, operational. Decommissioning, again, in the language of the standard, just to say again, we call that a project. So each project responding to a trigger event could be in operations, could be in projects, could be in something else. But again, if you think, oh, hang on, what's the word project doing there? It's the project is the information management project. And then each appointment of a lead appointed party they have to be appointed, someone has to do something, has to actually control, manage, make sure the information gets produced, and that's what we're looking at there. So you'll have multiple appointments, again, before, during and after, and a long time after construction. Again, construction may or may not be. Again, I've got fairly sort of long background in rail. I said I partly worked in rail, but for a long time and still to this day, we think complex. Operational infrastructure. It's maybe not in the UK this one, but again, there's millions and millions and millions of assets out there. It's not. Yes, we build things. Yes, we decommission things. But guess what? There's millions of assets out there that get maintained. Annually. They don't all necessarily get maintained, but there's millions of assets that are being used. Some of which are being maintained, some of which are being replaced. So again, and the information exists. Could it be structured better and be maintained more efficiently in some occasions? Yes. ISO 19650 series can help, as well as other standards. So again, the rail infrastructure systems and the asset as a whole, again, the term asset, which I didn't say already, can be one thing, or it could be the whole thing. It could be the whole network. So we don't define asset prescriptively. It's anything of value or potential value to an organisation. Indeed, information itself can be an asset and is an asset, but I've intentionally not got into that too much, but that's what we'd want people to consider, the information itself as the physical. So there is complexity and there's information. Again, just another example. Behind the scenes, there is information. Of course. Is it joined up? Depends. In some cases, very well. In some other cases, not so well. So again, some people are playing catch up. I mean, it's the same as any sector or domain. It's just, there's room to be done. But it tends to be critical infrastructure, like critical national infrastructure like rail, for example, is pretty, by many measures, good, because of the criticality. Now, this is one of the challenges, is many other sectors are not so mature with their management of information because of the immediacy. The criticality isn't there. So lessons learned. Another type of asset could be electrical distribution network. So again, it's obviously a power station here or a substation, some kind of electrical asset, highly complex. Is it modelled to this level of complexity? For most people, no. There'll just be a network, a system, a schematic diagram. Similar in the rail sector. Many people at an operational level don't need that granularity. We're working from schematics, representations, showing where things link. Back to this, there'll be some people that do need the detail. So again, considering what information we store through the systems, the enabling technologies, the common data environment, it will vary considerably depending who people are, what the purpose of the information is, and their perspective. And the perspectives is the term that we use. So again, many people considering the power generation and the transmission, how things link together, the asset as a whole. Again, behind the scenes, we do have this information. There is real-time monitoring. There is SCADA. There are telemetry. Are they all linked up? Absolutely, in many cases. Is this the norm in every sector? Not necessarily. So again, could it be? 100%, because information is obviously being produced in most sectors now. So whether people use ISO 19650 or not, information's being produced. Of course. So let's move on. Let's look at this. The draft, so ISO 9650, ISO/DIS 19650/2026, makes constraints more visible as well. What can you not use the information for example, or what does it might not be what you can't use the information for. It's maybe too blunt way of saying it. What are some of the limitations or indeed constraints? So it could be security. Maybe I can't share all of a model. I can share some of it. I need to break down the model, and I mean a geometric model, for example. So ISO 9650 Part 5 looks at a security-minded approach, and there's a lot to consider: physical, cyber, digital. So that might be one constraint. Legal and policy, it might be simply, say legal, it might be I don't own the information, I can't reshare the information, right? So there could be data protection. It could be I've got names of individuals, for example. There could be lots of different reasons why I can and cannot share it. At the bottom left, it might be that the format and quality of the information. So format, the schema, the format as in the file type or the schema or the structure, might be in a way that I actually can't share it, or I can't reuse it. I could share it, but maybe someone cannot open the information. So again, that makes a case for having interoperable open data, perhaps like IFC and others, when it's appropriate. So that might be one limitation. And then the technology, it might be that the systems don't talk to each other. Yes, I know there's APIs and all of this kind of stuff, but there are standards evolving. We could connect systems together, but would it be the right thing to do? Would it be efficient? So again, there may or may not be technical limitations. So procurement is treated as the procurement of information through appointments. Again, you could argue this has always been the case, but again, it's made clearer. So again, it's about procurement of information. So whether we're buying or procuring an asset at the same time, it might be a service that I'm procuring, but it's absolutely, the focus is about the information for a given purpose with my perspectives or whoever's going to use the information. So it's about the requirements and constraints we just mentioned. I need the information, but here's what I can and cannot do with the information, or the limitations of use. And it could simply be the intellectual property. It could be aerial imagery. I can't reuse it for another project, for example. It's got a timed license. It might be measured survey, and like an engineering or a land survey, a topographic survey. It's restricted for use on a certain specific purpose. This is not unusual. This is quite typical on some projects. So that's the first one. Really clear about why I need the information, what the constraints are. Request a response from the lead appointed party. It's an ask and response. Then we get evidence. Again, this is for another day, the detail, but we get evidence from the appointing party about the information that can be how they're going to capture, share, how is it going to work. Then they come up with a production plan and mobilization. How will they produce the information? They mobilize, they get into it, they mobilize the project to do that. And then the information models are created, produced, and then they're shared and submitted through the CDE. Again, the focus there is on the information itself. We've already mentioned the asset information model. So again, we used to, if you remember, if you're familiar with ISO 19650 2018, Part 1 2018, and Part 2, we talk about the project information model, or the PIM I've put there. So I've put project information model in full there. And we've had asset information model from the beginning of the ISO 19650 series. We don't talk about the project information model now, because it always fed in ultimately somehow into the asset information model, depending how you described it. Or we were always going to reuse the information for operations, or somebody was, again, maybe not you, but somebody was going to use it and hopefully maintain it. So the focus now is absolutely on that asset information model, keeping that managed, again, before, during and after a capital delivery project. Another type of asset just to consider might be university, college, campus, so again, college or university, however you want to call it. And there's a system as a whole. Yes, it's made of buildings, but there's more than that. We know that, right? There's lots of other things. There's asset owners and operators. That might be a perspective. What I haven't shown on the other asset examples I haven't talked about who might use the information. So just an example here might be the asset owner and operator. Okay, and then you can see there are students there. I've put the user of the facilities, and they could be academic faculty, professors, and others. Could be students and visitors, and of course there's lots of others. So again, they have a different perspective, different interpretation of what the physical asset means, what information they might want to learn. So for example, if I'm maintaining, pipes, utilities under the ground there, you can see I would be considering that maintenance. Where are they? Physically, where are they? And on the left, you can see I've mentioned BIM, as in geometric models, asset management systems, GIS, geographic information systems, survey, all these different systems that exist. We do this already. So again, we're trying to link things together. However, if I'm somebody else, I might be considering different analytics. I might want dashboards. Look at the bottom. Environmental, ESG, environmental, social and governance, or corporate governance, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Again, I don't get into that, but there's someone somewhere needs that information, again, maybe before, during, after projects in operations. They look like dashboards. They look like business intelligence. They are business intelligence. They are analytics. We're talking about information management. What they are is management information. So that's for another day. But again, that's what a lot of people will be reusing the information for. And another example here is just to focus on the people, for example. There are thousands and thousands of assets probably just in here, depending how you define an asset, right? Or at least hundreds in shot here. But from a customer in the London Underground, we say customer or passenger perspective, we want the service to work. So again, we're thinking about the network as a whole. We're not thinking, well, maybe I might be having a partial background in engineering and data, but most people are just thinking, is this train going to run, or can I get home? It's a different way of thinking about things. And operations will be thinking, is the track available? That's the term we use, availability. Is it reliable? Reliability. Again, these are all asset management concepts. So something to think about is the network, or the system of systems. Why am I talking about that? Because, of course, that's all data-driven as well. So again, that information feeds in. Bringing it back to ISO 19650 series, we need that underlying trustworthy information about where the assets are. So just an example there, you can see walkways. I'm not too sure I'd walk close to the edge of the platform there, but you can see like walkways, designated walkways. What do they rely on? On the platform information being up to date. So again, we need this being people-centric, this focus on the customer, the passenger. In this example, network performance. And again, maybe it's layered on, getting back to ISO 19650 series, it's layered on top of the physical asset. It's, as I say, a service. So getting back to the standard, we've had our examples there. Again, the review or the update, we do talk about the language becomes more precise about reviewing the information. This is linked to the common data environment, or the enabling technology and the common data environment as a process, or as a workflow rather. We talk about check, review, approve, authorize, accept. Again, won't go into more detail, as we'll talk about that more when we talk about part 2. But really clear, it's more precise than it was before. From a conceptual level, you could argue there's nothing new, but again, it's clearer. It's really clear. Federation is separated from information container breakdown. They were sort of pushed together, different concepts, but they were closer before. But federation, again, for people that don't know, what do we mean by that? About combining information from separate sources into a specific purpose without merging authorship. It's about combining things, temporarily. It's about having a geometric model, for example, doesn't have to be this, but geometric model A, B, and C, and we merge, if you like, temporarily federating them together. So we could do things like clash detection, clash avoidance, visualization, things like this, but we keep the source, the origin, separate. Federation, thinking about the actual word federation, what it means in other contexts, what does it mean? Without getting too deep into this, it means we have different rules. I mean, that's literally, like a federal government, for example. There's universal rules, laws or rules, standards that cover everything. So we're all working toward the same common rules. That's literally what federation is, because then you have your own local rules. So, for example, an architect, a surveying company, someone doing the civil engineering, for example, they all have the same high-level rules about managing information, sharing information, naming information, what softwares they might use, depending, and then they'll have local specific, but coordinate reference system or grid system or spatial coordinates. The map, we all work to the same grid, and then we can bring things together. So that's sort of federation, what federation means. Information container breakdown, that's more specific. It's about dividing an information model into specific managed containers. We don't specifically use the word file because it might not be a file, right? It could be, but it might not be. Certainly, we made the leap several years ago in geographic information systems where typically you're probably not sharing a file a lot of the time. We're sharing links, URLs, we might be sharing a mini database, but whether we're sharing an actual file or some kind of data feed or some kind of connection or API, we need a way of describing how we break up or chunk up or segregate the information. So the language that we're using there is container, right? So that's at a more granular level. That could be rooms, it could be elements, objects. It depends. That's why it's a generic term, container. That is part of the process. It needs to be defined. So ISO 19650 series is a process. They are particularly part 2, which is obviously looking at the information management process itself. It walks people through these considerations, and again we'll cover that on another one. So again, part 1 now acts as a more clear overview. We've mentioned that already. Absolutely, it includes all of them. So there are now 6 parts, and there have been for some time. Part 6 came out, ISO 19650 Part 6 came out in January 2025. And again, hence why part 1, part 2, part 3 didn't mention it, because it didn't exist. But now they all link together very nicely, and I've already mentioned what they are. Again, just a reminder of this is again a stylized version. You won't get them looking like this anywhere, but again a stylized version of the 6 parts and how they work together. Certainly part 5, absolutely. Should security be a fundamental consideration for everything? 100%. Of course it should be. If ISO 19650 series as a whole doesn't encourage it, mandates under contract the sharing of information. And why do we need information? That's what it's about. It's about making people share information, in the right format at the right time for the right purpose. Should security be one of the fundamental considerations? 100%. 100%. So again, that theme is made clearer as well, and we'll cover part 5 in another presentation. So a stronger training storyline emerges. So again, BIM Enable, we are absolutely focused on training. We often create and deliver training on behalf of others, including whole training frameworks. So again, this is why I'm personally very interested in the training and the way we communicate the needs to people. But again, why do we need the information? That's always been a theme, but has it been strong enough? Maybe not. So again, why do we need the information? Why are we doing these things? Why are we implementing the standard? Why are we now asking for an IFC model, for example, in a certain granularity level of information need? We need to be clear about that. How is it going to be used? Who needs it? What is it for? What's the purpose? Purposes, maybe it's going to be used for this purpose, then it's going to be reused for that purpose. Maybe it's going to be combined. Maybe it needs to be updated at some point in the near future. What is required as far as the detail, and what are the constraints? I mentioned security being one consideration. Contractual ownership of information will be another, and there's lots of others. So again, we don't want to overshare. Oversharing information is possibly worse, depending how you look at it, than undersharing. If I don't have information, I know I don't have it and I need to get it. If information has been inadvertently, for example, shared with people that shouldn't have it, that's not good either. So again, that's what we're considering about the constraints, keeping things secure. How is information produced? What's the methodology? What's the software? Even things like software versions. I won't name any softwares, but you can fill the gap with certain CAD and building information modeling software, or GIS software, or document authoring software. it often, I was going to say it often can be critical that people are on the same version of the actual software for various reasons. So again, really important, that might be something where, so number 5 there, where we say, how is it produced? Teams, plans, workflow, technologies. So the authoring technology, the information production technology. And how is it trusted? What's the process, the workflow that it's gone through to check, review, approve, and authorize and accept? Do I know the provenance or the history of that information? I want to, so a lot of my career has definitely been reusing information. 100% geographic information systems, I'm reusing measured survey information, for example, or CAD, computer-aided design, or building information modeling information. I didn't create it. So having that trust, do I trust the information? Who knows, right? You have to be really confident. So look up the term, which I don't really mention in this presentation, is metadata. Do I have enough information or data about the data? Do I have enough information to trust? And again, that's where ISO 19650 Part 4 can come in and help. Again, that's about the quality of the information exchange. Something to add is when, which isn't in here explicitly, but when is information needed? 100%. That's implied in the others, but just to call it out explicitly. Where does it relate to? I couldn't have a background in GIS and mapping originally and not mention it. So where does it relate? Is it the whole site? Is it a room? Is it, or a space as we'd call it? Is it, do we have restrictions in this part of this country or this site? Who knows? Really important. So where information, I'll just, I'll always come back to that anyway, but often that's one of the first things that people think of information is where does it relate to, not what is it and where does it. And just broadening the topic up and coming sort of full circle to when we talked about the asset information sort of cycle and the asset management cycle we looked at earlier, is why. So again, absolutely coming back to the why, which is the first point as well, but why, the purposes for information from different perspectives. I might need the information because I'm a water infrastructure company. I might need the information because I'm a company about to provide construction work to undertake a job, and I don't want to hit that water infrastructure, right? So I want to avoid. I might be an electrical distribution company. I might be, again, want that for security purposes. I might be a hospital looking at resilience. I might want more than one input of electricity, so again, there could be strategic. And there's a bigger why, if you like. I've put it in capital letters at the bottom right there, where it says why, the ultimate why. It's the way I'm describing it. The outcomes. So we do talk about outcomes in the standard, but again, I'm sort of reiterating this, emphasizing this. Ultimately, why are we doing all of this at all? Why do we want the information? Why are we managing the assets? Right? To provide services to people and providing better outcomes for people. So it could be for families, it could be hospitals, it could be making sure the assets are more resilient to natural disasters like tsunamis, volcanoes. We have exclusion zones, for example. It could be flood defenses. Many different reasons. It could be planning. It could be looking at demographic modeling projections. I know there will be a increased population in this area, or there's a likely increased population in this area. Maybe we need to plan now with the integrated infrastructure, transportation, energy. Well, the energy, car charging, right? There's thousands, infinite numbers. So what's the big why? And at the very bottom right there, you can see there's something that looks like the countryside there, the planet. So again, these ultimate whys. Can we make construction and the operation and the decommissioning and the reuse of assets greener? So are we looking at embedded carbon? Are we looking at sustainability? Do we need metrics to feed into other management systems? 14,001, for example. So I'll leave that with you. There's always a bigger why. It might not be your immediate why, but it's this bigger why. Do we need the information? Where could the information be used, and where perhaps should it be used now? So again, just briefly at a glance, again, the reframing, summarizing now is, we did talk about BIM according to ISO 9650 before. Again, it's more focused on information management as a whole, and BIM is absolutely part of that. Building information modeling, again, is a subset. We talk about geometric information. We talk about alphanumeric, or that's more like tabulated information. So machine readable, structured information, we're calling alphanumeric information, tabulated information, and documentation, typical documents and other things, lots of other files, could be images. So they're the main types or flavors of information. There's lots of others, but to focus the mind. So is BIM forgotten? Absolutely not, but it's broader. Information production is now more the focus. We've mentioned that already. The EIR becomes the information production requirements. We mentioned that. BIM execution plan, the MIDP, the Master Information Delivery Plan, and the Task Information Delivery Plan respectively become the Information Production Plan, and the MIDP and the TIDP are merged and become the Information Production Schedule or Schedule, again, depending where you are. And the CDE absolutely exists as a term, but again, we're focused on it not just being the enabling technology, but we're calling it an operational framework, and there's still a clear workflow within that. And the last thing that I've probably mentioned many, many times in this presentation is an absolute clear focus, merging of the consideration of a whole life asset response to a trigger event, whether, looking at the way we described it before, whether it happens to be capital delivery or operational or something else, like I keep adding decommissioning there as well. So again, just as we summarize this presentation, this I used at the beginning. What I didn't pick up was where we say who, what, why, who, what, when, where, why, etc. They were in there. So again, these are questions that we have always considered. We've maybe not used that language. Certainly I have liked using that language to simplify things throughout my career about why do we need the information? I know what information someone's telling me. They say I need this kind of CAD information or survey or whatever, or document. I say I understand, but why do you need it? Who's going to use it? Will it be reused? When is it needed? Is it a critical decision? So again, these need to be addressed, and we're using that language: who, what, why, when, where, etc. Again, for the life cycle. And again, why is arguably the most important, right? Why do I need this information? Just as a quick aside, I have, like I said, an information management and partly an IT background in many sectors. We already do this in enterprise architecture. So I'm just reflecting. I'm saying ISO 9650 series are absolutely critical about having a common language and introducing perhaps these concepts to many people. However, I just acknowledge that there are other domains in IT or information management, or however you want to look at it, that already talk about these things. So I'm just telling you, it may or may not be relevant to you directly, but at least look it up. So for example, there's a domain, discipline and domain called enterprise architecture, which is more than IT, but it's associated with IT and information management. And it's looking at why do we want things, So what, how, who, where, when, why. And that's from the 90s or the 80s. And we talk about metadata management. That's keeping information on information, data on data. So I'm just saying these concepts are not new, right? So, but again, we're introducing them with slightly different language in different terminologies to people. But I just thought I'd acknowledge the concept of enterprise architecture that can benefit, and vice versa. People who aren't familiar could maybe benefit. But this standard ISO 9650 is that focal point to start that conversation. Likewise, asset management, I've mentioned many times. That's already talking about things that we're introducing. So again, just acknowledging it, if you are interested, the one thing to consider is the Zachman framework. You don't need to know this, but I'm just making the point that who, what, when, where, why, etc. Again, from the 1980s. Again, this is IT or related to IT, called enterprise architecture. And there it is. So again, beyond the scope of what we're looking at, beyond, however, it's looking at how do information systems as one thing work towards a business, an organization. How do the processes, the systems, and I mean not necessarily the IT systems, but the governance framework, how does it relate? So everything's interconnected. Getting back to ISO 19650, we are focused on what we're focused, which is the management of information for built assets, 100%. But maybe there's some learnings from other sectors. And the last thing, just probably get back to our questions that we started with, to say, hang on a minute, then they have been talking about this in other domains for a long time. So you can see, just reflecting on, this is the 4th century BCE, before the Common Era, Aristotle was talking about what, who, where, when, why, and how. Back then, different topics, no doubt. But linking things, the whole point I'm making here is about things being linked, and relationships and context and meaning and the bigger picture literally is. So again, it's trying to simplify. Right, getting back to the standard, I said I'd answer these questions, and hopefully we have, and lots more, I hope. So what is changing in ISO 19650 Part 1, at least in the draft standard as we have it? So it's being reframed from a BIM focus concepts standard to a broader information management standard. So again, BIM is a term we still use, but it's broader. It's absolutely broader. And like I've said, it always was, but the language was maybe confusing at times. So it's absolutely about the management of information. To what end? For the whole life management of assets and the life cycle around that. Is this still about BIM or wider information management? I think we've already answered that question. It's definitely is about BIM, but I'm calling it a subset. It's one thing we consider. Geometric information, absolutely. Maybe BIM would, well, not maybe, BIM would be in that, as would survey, CAD, GIS, and other types of information, remote sensing perhaps. We also talk about alphanumeric information, tabulated, structured, machine readable information with a known schema, and we talk about documentation, but it's no longer the focus, BIM alone. What does whole life asset information management mean in practice? Information management before, during, and after projects, as I've said many times. So again, that's a lot, and just some way of portraying it is around strategy, design, construction, operation, maintenance, refurbishment, and end of life decisions. Reuse, of course, which isn't mentioned there. So again, there's many ways. Commissioning, the word commissioning isn't there either. A real big one that I think should be mentioned more is commissioning. People need information for commissioning. I know it's included in there, but just to draw that out as well. Why does information purpose matter before deliverables? Because organizations should understand why information is needed. Again, ultimately, unless the information is being produced for free, there's a cost. Right? So we don't want to deliver information. Too much information could be as bad or possibly worse as too little. As I've said, it depends on your interpretation and the example. So one example might be a big fat document, with hundreds of pages. People don't read it, it depends, right? So again, we need to be appropriate and proportionate in the approach and get the right level of information, fulfill the right level of information need, and then check it. So again, whether that's automatically or with people involved still. And how is the common data environment being reframed? Again, we've mentioned the CD is being reframed as an operational framework. So again, that includes workflows, which we used to call process, but a workflow, rules, permissions, statuses, archive, and the underpinning enabling technologies. Not just one technology or technological platform. It could be, but that's not how we're defining it, right? It has to have characteristics, behaviors, which is more than here is the technology. And which templates, terms, and training may need updating. So the EIR, the Exchange Information Requirement, the BEP, the BIM Execution Plan, the MIDP, the Master Information Delivery Plan, the TIDP, the Task Information Delivery Plan, and guidance around what the common data environment is and isn't and how it's used is almost certainly going to need updating because of the change in the terms. I said almost certainly with regard to the CDE. If we're defining what the CDE is, then we're defining it slightly differently. And even for example, the states within the CDE are now different as well. So 100% something has to change there. The appointment wording might change, process maps, workflows, glossaries of terms, and we need to upskill people. The language is changing, it will change. So I encourage you to take action. Again, this is the main purpose of this presentation. So read the standards in full. This presentation is on behalf of BIM Enable, and we can advise you, but we strongly encourage you to obviously read the standards in full, whether they're in draft or formally published. And there'll be some things you don't understand. Again, there is the guide. There will be parts 2 and part 3, part 3 being the guide for part 2, which we'll cover in more detail on another presentation. Check whether your common data environment approach is workflow led, not just platform led, so that you're not just talking about the technology. This is a key one for me. Again, the main purpose of this presentation: prepare teams beyond BIM. It's more than BIM. There's asset managers, facility management teams, facility management individuals, digital teams, digital engineering, digital construction, digital in a corporate sense, chief data officer, others, IT, information technology, governance. So IT, digital and governance and security all linked together. There are standards like ISO 27001, for information security management systems, that link with part 5, for example. So there's bigger things going on out there. We need to link to them. And it may or may not affect people's roles in what they do now, what they might be doing in the near future. So we need HR to be involved as well at some point. The earlier the better, that everyone has an awareness. Engagement with the asset management team, 100%. I put that in there because that's other part of my career is in asset management, and I'm in physical assets of any scale. So again, it could be at a national level. Certainly I do work in that at a national level for often governments as well. So how to unlock the value from assets. Part of that is understanding, having more information on the assets, asset registers, for example. And achieve senior leadership or director or C-level, so the chief information officer, the chief CEO, chief executive officer, for example, chief financial officer, the operational director, the project director, senior leaders. Now, the ISO 19650 series isn't a management system standard yet. Maybe it will be at some point in the future, but it feeds into these management system standards. It feeds into and links with, contributes to, enables ISO 55001, ISO 9001, etc., 14001. I could go on. Do they all need information? 100%. Right? So particularly 55,000 and others. So again, would the senior leadership be interested in improving information about all of our assets before, during and after construction, in operations, planning? I think they would be. We need to describe ISO 19650 in that way, how it adds value. And then the last action I would recommend is for you to seek advice, seek expert advice to plan and prepare for the transition to the new parts, or the updated parts, not the new parts, so ISO 9650 Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, when they're published. So prepare. It's not too early to prepare. Yes, things may change, the terminologies may change. So again, we need to be careful, particularly around contracts, but while we're in this draft phase, we can prepare. And it's not too early to prepare, to look at what the impacts might be. So I'd certainly encourage you to, again, look at the draft standards. If you're looking at this after they've come out, then read the new standards, compare them. And you can reach out to us. So if you go to bimenable.com, this is what we do. We train, we create training for others, we deliver training for others as well, whether it's in your organization, whether it's a small, very large organization, or even a national, maybe it's a government, or it could be a small and medium enterprise, or in between. Or you could be an individual. We train people, we help them navigate the jargon, the terminology. That's absolutely what we are focused on, and keeping it simple. So again, the complexity needs to be handled by the right people. Does everybody need to be an expert in everything? No, they do not. Do some people need to be experts in different areas? 100%, and they need to learn about the changes now. So we can help with terminology reviews, some of the terms from the standard that are changing, process and template updates, make some suggestions, potentially make the changes with you or help you make them. Look at technology. Our origins are 100% in the actual technology, not just the information management, but the actual technology and how it links, and systems integration, for example, GIS and different common data environment systems, and training and consultancy. So absolutely we can help. So please do reach out. So I hope that was useful. Again, that was an overview to ISO 19650 Part 1, the changes. So ISO/DIS 19650 Part 1 2026. Do reach out, do look at our website. There is also an assessment tool on there for maturity. That will be being updated now or soon as well. So please do look at the website. I hope that was useful. Again, my name is Stephen, and thank you for listening.